in the way that's the most easiest and convenient for them to do. Every eligible voter should not have problems casting their ballot, and that hasn't been happening, and they need to see leadership that's going to get that done.
Steve, same question. What do you think it comes down to?
I agree. Voters are fed up, and I think the election we just had in Maricopa County is just one more instance of that. They want somebody who can operate the Secretary of State's office and make it run, function, and serve the people.
Does it matter if you have an R or a D before your name in this job?
From my perspective, it does not. If you are competent and you can discharge the responsibilities of the office, hire people who are capable, evaluate them, motivate them, that's really what's important.
Katie, same thing. D or R? I mean, we think of that job as nonpartisan, yet you are the lieutenant governor in waiting. So, does it matter?
The Secretary of State absolutely needs to be the most nonpartisan elected official that we have in our state. And so party aside, it's the person who can do the job the best. And in terms of the lieutenant governor aspect, whoever's in that office, solving the problems of the state of Arizona, it shouldn't be partisan either. It should be about working with whoever you can to get things done for the people of Arizona.
Let's throw up the picture, because it is astonishing how many times we've gone down this road. Since I've been here, it's happened 4 times. Rose Mofford, Jane Hull, Janet Napolitano, Governor Brewer. Also, they all came out of the Secretary of State office. This is our lieutenant governor. There's no other way to put it. People are voting for who could take the reins of government here in the state. How much should they calculate that into their vote in November?
Well, I want to be clear that I'm running for Secretary of State because that's the job I want, and that's the job. Voters deserve somebody who wants to do that job and can be competent in doing that job. It is a really important function. But I think voters are well aware that they're also electing the person that could be the next governor, and they absolutely need to elect the most qualified person to do that.
Steve, how much should that figure into people's calculus?
They need to understand that it's part of the job. It's something that possibly could happen, you pointed out, but I think the central responsibility is the Chief Elections Officer of the state and the other parts of the Secretary of State's office.
Just so people will take a kind of a breath here, and I'll start with you, Steve. Give me your experience and why that lends itself to a yes, a Steve Gaynor vote in November for Secretary of State. Tell me about your experience.
Right. Well, you know, I went to Harvard Business School, got an MBA. They teach you something about business there, but
Grew up where?
I grew up in New York.
Okay.
Met my wife in Boston. She was a native of Tucson. So I've been here for 37 years. Watched the Valley grow up, watched my 3 kids grow up. They're all here in the metro area. So I've had a long history in the state. And I went into the printing business 30 years ago, started with a little shop in West Phoenix, and it grew to a pretty sizable company. I had 350 employees, and I've done a lot of transactions. I've actually done a lot of turnaround work. I viewed the Secretary of State's office as a turnaround. It's an organization that's not functioning very well, and there are some problems there. I think in my background, interestingly, in printing, it matches up pretty well with what needs to be done in the Secretary of State's office.
Your experience, you know, all of that. You never jumped into the public fray. You never jumped into politics until now. Why?
Well, I've been active in Republican politics, but I didn't think about running for office. The situation was brought to my attention that there was a problem, and I had to take a long look at it to see if my skills and my knowledge was a match with this office. And my conclusion was that it was. I've done a lot of work in document security, information technology, and the size of the office itself is less than I've handled. So I think I bring a lot to the table.
Katie, same thing. We know you as a state senator from Phoenix. You were with Sojourner Center before that. Tell me a little bit about your experience as well, so voters can kind of size you guys up.
Sure. Yeah, in my career as a social worker, I spent more than a decade as the Chief Compliance Officer at Sojourner Center, which grew to be one of the largest domestic violence shelters in the country. And in that role, it was my job to make sure that we are complying with all the laws and the regulations that came along with all of the federal and state dollars that we had to run the shelter and programs, as well as the licenses that we had to maintain to keep our doors open. And doing my job meant that we were able to provide services for thousands of victims and their children that were fleeing violent situations. It was juggling a lot of complex projects. It was largely administrative, and that is the skill that's needed to turn around the mismanagement in the Secretary of State's office and make sure that it is working for the people of Arizona, because that is what I've advocated for my whole career, is to make government work better for the people of Arizona.
When you ran for state senate, was it prompted by your work in the social work field where you said, these folks need a voice? Is that?
Absolutely. I saw a government that wasn't working for the people, and I thought that I could go and try to help do better.
Does the state senator work, as Steve talked about his business background, dovetails into this nicely? State senator, those skills?
Sure.
Translate?
I have spent the last 8 years in the trenches understanding how government works from the political side, and I think that's really critical going into this role in the Secretary of State's office. I also served as the ranking member of the Elections Committee in the Senate, and I have a long record of getting things done in the really partisan legislature.
Let me talk about a couple of foul-ups we've had in local elections. These really kind of started on the ground in Maricopa County. The first one was the presidential preference in 2016. Lines out the door. People couldn't get into their polling places. Polling places had been reduced to 60 from, I believe, what, 120?
379
okay, yeah, well,
in the last double primary we had.
So we saw this unfolding.
Yeah.
Helen Purcell lost her job over it. She ran elections, again, as long as I've been here. But what responsibility did the Secretary of State have for this? And what would you have done, Steve?
Well, there was responsibility there, but because the Secretary of State is the chief elections officer, does review the plan, and the plan clearly was deficient. There also was a conflict between the state and the county in terms of what was going to be reimbursed for this election, and the Secretary of State failed to resolve that issue. I think she should have been involved with the county supervisors and taken a proactive stance in resolving the financial issue.
It came down to a money thing?
Well, yes, in part, sure.
Who was going to get billed?
Who was going to pay? Yes.
Interesting. Katie, what should the Secretary of State, in that case it was Michelle Reagan who you defeated in the primary, Steve, but what should the Secretary of State have done in that situation?
It's about being a leader. As the chief election officer of the state, regardless if something falls directly under your job or not, the buck stops with you. And Michelle Reagan failed on many counts in showing leadership. It's not just about signing off on the plan or knowing what the plan is. It's working proactively with every county recorder to make sure that they have plans and contingency plans, and that this doesn't happen, that voters aren't having this inconvenience to exercise their democratic right to vote.
In the case of Michelle Reagan, I mean, you beat her more than 2-1 in the primary. At the time, you said this was a battle between Steve and Michelle on the Republican side, between, what did you say, incompetence and...
Inexperience.
And inexperience. Yes. That was yours. Inexperience and competence for Michelle Reagan.
Yeah.
You stand by that?
Yes.
You stand by that?
I do.
Steve, Katie was not opposed in the Democratic primary.
Right.
What's your biggest quarrel with her if she were to get the job?
Well, not too long ago, she said she was going to use the office of Secretary of State to give an advantage to Democrats and in a public meeting. That's certainly something I would not do, and I don't think is right to do.
What I have said from day one in this campaign is that I am running for Secretary of State to be a champion for the voters, to be someone who is going to ensure that every single eligible voter in the state of Arizona, Democrat, Republican, Independent, can exercise their right to vote. It is about fairness. Now, what Mr. Gaynor has said about this office is that he thinks we should get rid of the Voting Rights Act. That is an extremely partisan agenda. If we did that, we would have people who are eligible to vote would not be able to vote in Arizona.
Yeah.
Okay, can you guys hold this for over the break?
Sure.
When we get back, I think the fireworks are starting to break out here. We're back after this break on Newsmaker Saturday. Steve Gaynor, Katie Hobbs running for Secretary of State for Arizona. Back in a minute. And welcome back to Newsmaker Saturday. Pleased to be joined again as we talk about the Secretary of State's office. Katie Hobbs, former state senator from Phoenix. Steve Gaynor, Republican, businessman. And they're squaring off for what arguably is the second most important position in Arizona, because whoever wins this job could end up Arizona's governor if anything were to happen, or if Doug Ducey moved on. And we've seen that happen 4 times in the last 30 years. We were talking about competence on elections. Let's go to Adrian Fontes in this most recent election. Polls weren't opening. They weren't ready to go in the morning. He ran, forget party, he ran on competence. So we're going to replace Helen Purcell, and we're going to get some competence and run these things right. Let me start with Katie. This is a guy from your party. You've been very critical. Did he blow it, and how did he blow it?
Look, I don't want to talk about what Adrian Fontes did or didn't do. I think what happened on Election Day was unacceptable. And what I can tell you is that as Secretary of State, I will be working proactively with every single county recorder in the state of Arizona so that this type of thing does not happen. The Secretary of State needs to be involved and make sure that plans are in place so that we don't have this kind of disaster and that people can exercise their democratic right to vote.
Steve, what happened here? And is Adrian Fontes, the buck stops with him?
I think it does.
Not the vendor in sight.
You know, I don't know what happened between the county and the vendor. I think it's troubling that he didn't release the report. I think we'll eventually find out, but the vendor has said it wasn't their fault. I think he and his operation failed to anticipate that there could be problems and didn't have a backup plan. In this particular case, no matter how much the Secretary of State worked with the Recorder's Office, I don't know that the Secretary of State could have done anything to intervene and prevent this.
Well, the Secretary of State could make sure that the county recorders do have backup plans so that if there's something that fails, there's a contingency to go to.
Yeah, he claims that he did. And you know, he says that he had a contingency plan. He didn't notify even the people he worked for, the county supervisors, right when he found out that he had a problem. He kind of kept it to himself, and then it unfolded.
One of the issues that came out in the campaign was that you made a comment at a town hall about you didn't see the necessity of why we were printing ballots in Spanish.
Yeah.
Tell me how you came to this.
It's not a matter of necessity. I'll tell you where it came from. My grandparents were immigrants, all of them. They came to this country not speaking any English. They came through Ellis Island. And my grandfather waited in, he's from Austria originally, waited in Rio de Janeiro for 5 years to come here. They all came, they got jobs, they learned the language. And I remember asking my grandfather why he was reading the newspaper in English, because there was a German paper that he would have had easier to read. And he said to me, "Steve, this is America," in heavily accented English. "We speak English." He knew that speaking English was the path to success. And frankly, I owe my success to his sacrifice.
That is, I've heard this story repeated by many different people. I'm not talking about the specifics of yours, but many different immigrant families saying the same thing. Do you think that this amounts to racism, or is this just something that somebody feels strongly?
Well, I think clearly Mr. Gaynor feels strongly about it, and I don't want to argue the language issue in terms of whether people should or shouldn't speak English. I think, you know, that's a different issue. But what I will say is that when you say we should stop printing voting materials in the languages that are required under the Federal Voting Rights Act, that what you're doing then is inviting the federal government to come into the state of Arizona and then take over our elections. And I don't think anybody wants them to do that. You're inviting lawsuits, expensive lawsuits, at the expense of taxpayers, and that's a waste of taxpayer dollars.
Yeah. What of course didn't get reported was, what I also said was, I'll follow the law and all of them. So if the law says multiple languages, of course that's what I would do.
We've got about a minute and a half left. Why have we had so many problems with elections in Arizona? What is going on? We can't seem to get this right, Katie.
Again, the right to vote is the foundation of our democracy, and every single elected election official should be focused on that and making sure we're doing everything possible to make sure that voters can exercise that right in a way that doesn't cause them to wait for 2 hours or whatever. That is a serious thing, and as Secretary of State, as the Chief Election Officer of the state, I will make sure that I'm working with every single county recorder so that we are executing these in the way that they should be executed and that voters can exercise that right.
It's job one. Steve, same thing. Same question. What is the problem?
Yeah, you need people who understand how to operate, how to deploy assets to accomplish a mission. And unfortunately, in some areas of the state, we don't have that. We need people who understand how to run an operation, and I think that's why I ran. I saw that there was a problem. I knew I could fix it.
Steve Gaynor and Katie Hobbs, appreciate your time today on Newsmaker Saturday. Best of luck in the election. Still ahead on Newsmaker Saturday, we talked to Fox News' Harris Faulkner, a town hall this weekend talking about all issues Arizona. Harris is up next on Newsmaker Saturday. Harris has got a very special lineup coming this Sunday night on Fox News Channel. It will air here at 5 o'clock. This is going to be a town hall with America. Harris, great to see you.
Great to see you, too. And thanks for kicking off with Katy Perry there in Firework, because that's kind of how I feel right now.
Right.
It's warm, and it's always beautiful, and so are the people of Arizona. I'm so excited. You know, John, this is an important conversation to have at any time. Our current president has put illegal immigration and the wall system that he wants to build and all of these topics on the landscape. And then the news is kind of folded in with Kate Steinle and Molly Tibbetts cases. And so there are some hot button issues around illegal immigration. We're going to get to the heart of it with a live audience tomorrow night, so I'm super excited.
Obviously, Arizona is in play because of some key congressional elections as well as a Senate race that everybody is watching. So you're going to sit down with Martha McSally and Kirsten Sinema. This is one of the most watched races for the U.S. Senate in the country. I take it that is the main reason why you're coming to Arizona.
Well, the main reason is to cover the conversation that's going on around illegal immigration in Arizona is such a template, if you will, a microcosm of a greater conversation and debate that are going on across the country, with sanctuary cities popping up in all sorts of states far away from the border. So the main reason is to get into that national debate. Along with that, of course, is one of the most fiercely watched races in the midterm elections, as you've just mentioned. 2 women, 2 former military veterans, 2 people who have independent, loud voices in their parties, respectively, in a red state where a Democrat is trying to give a Republican a run for her money. It is all the things that the midterm elections are made of, which drive voter intensity for both parties. So I'm thrilled to be able to cover all of it in such a different fashion. You know, I'll sit down with each candidate. We'll have a live audience react to each of them, and then we'll talk about all of these broader issues with illegal immigration, the push to abolish ICE, for example, national security wrapped around, you know, some of the issues of family separation at the border. These are tough things to talk about, and we've got some great special guests as well.
Yeah, you've got an Arizona rancher, and you've got former Border Patrol folks who are also going to take part in this town hall. We should mention that it is at Royal Palms. There are not tickets available. It is already spoken for, sold out. But
popular. People wanted to come.
That's right. That's right. Having those 2 factions, having the ranchers, the Border Patrol people, that's another perspective that you sometimes don't get.
All right, so what that gives us is the everyday allocation of resources and how stretched and challenged they are along our border for Border Patrol. Part of the president's plan and what he's wanted to do is, yes, build the wall, and also use some of the money where you can't build a wall to fortify sections of the border all the way to California, as far west as that. So you've got those issues going on that the Border Patrol vice president of the National Border Patrol Council, there are about 4,500 members that he represents. that'll be some really interesting conversation about MS-13 and the drug cartels and things that he deals with law enforcement-wise on the border. But then from the rancher who's joining us, you know, you hear this talk about, well, eminent domain. Look, he says, I want whatever it takes to secure the border because people are walking across his land, John, illegally at all hours of the day and night.
We've heard
Can
these
you imagine?
stories. Sure.
Now, here's a little surprise toss-in. Along with those two, we'll have a third who'll join us. She is a DACA recipient, a former press secretary for Bernie Sanders. Also someone who has had some experience with these issues from the other direction. So a bipartisan live audience. We'll talk with Sinema and McSally. And then we have a really interesting lineup of stakeholders on that dais with me.
That's great. Harris, you know, Trump won Arizona. That was not a surprise, but he didn't win it by a huge margin. There's all this
4 points, I believe.
Yeah, and there's all this discussion, and I've heard it since I've been here, and that's over 25 years, that this state is turning purple. Do you believe it?
Well, you know, from everything that I've covered, you know, I remember when Dr. Kelly Ward took on John McCain and came within 11 points of him. So there would be some strong argument politically wise and platform wise that it is not as purple as people think. But what I do think is true about Arizonans, and I have in-laws in that state and many family members because I'm married into an Arizona family.
Yeah, right.
They like good ideas. And you know what happens when you put good people together, no matter which side of the political aisle they're from? They're determined to come up with good ideas. And, you know, as we approach this town hall, I want voices at the table. We'll have independents or non-declared, I like to call them, they're not quite sure who they're going to vote for, in the audience, along with Democrats and Republican voters. And these are people who intend to go to the polls, which you and I both know they're motivated. Those are the people you want to have these conversations because they'll decide things for people who don't even decide to show up to vote. So what I know about Arizonans is that they want to hear from everybody because they're in the mindset of it's not who's right, it's what's right. I say it on my program every day on Outnumbered Overtime at 1 p.m. Eastern, 10 a.m. where you are. I say it all the time.
It's a great show.
Thanks, a little plug there. It is about coming together and figuring out what's right. And it's okay to have tough conversation doing that. It's absolutely fine to disagree. That's where I think Arizona is.
Yeah.
I lived in a purple state. I lived in Minnesota. It's a different feel. You will get a guy like a Jesse Ventura to come out of that political ilk. You know, it's a Walter Mondale state. It's also a Tim Pawlenty state. I think Arizona is more about where's the good idea and less about the politics of trying to make everybody kind of come together in the middle.
Well, listen, I cannot wait to see it. Town Hall America with Harris Faulkner Sunday, and it's at 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 o'clock here in Arizona, and it will be videotaped or live from the Royal Palms in Phoenix. Harris, great to see you, and we're glad that you call Arizona home as well as New York. So thank you.
Me too. Thank you, John. All the best to you.
Thank you. We'll see you soon. Thank you, Harris Faulkner, Fox News Channel. We will see you next week on Newsmaker Saturday. Thanks for joining us.